there's been some decision that is a bit awkward, or there's something that's making life slightly difficult for someone in government, so they decided not to do it anymore, but did not appreciate that something like this is not just a nice to have. It's actually crucially important for a democratic society to have proper access to the courts.
We're going to start with the court system, which is on the brink of collapse, according to a review by the retired senior judge Sir Brian Leveson. With open, timely justice already under threat, you might be surprised to hear that the place where many of the system's decisions are recorded is being shut down. The Times would agree it's wrong. Today's Thunderer column calls on the government to think again about the closure of this archive, which is called Court's Desk. We can talk to George Greenwood, who's investigations reporter for the paper, who wrote the Thunderer column. Hello, George.
Good afternoon.
So many people will never have heard of Court's Desk. So paint a picture of what it is, what it does.
Sure. So basically, we have a very, very fragmented court system. Records are very difficult to get hold of, very expensive to get hold of, and one solution to some of these problems was this company called Court's Desk. They set up a system whereby they collated court lists and information about court case outcomes from magistrates' courts around the country into a really easily accessible, usable database that journalists or people who had a right to access that material already could access, and then allowed us to search across the records to find trends, to find cases we might want to cover, to find case studies for our stories, and also keep up to date on cases that were quite difficult to track from the outside. Now, that has all been shut down by the government. It's not clear why. The government at the dispatch box, the Minister, Sarah Sackman, claimed that there was an issue with data protection around how they'd used the material they collected, but it was not serious enough for them to report this to the Data Commissioner in the UK, the ICO, who regulates this matter. It is really, really odd and very damaging because this kind of database actually opened up the courts to many people who would simply not be able to access it, be they reporters or people working very closely on researching court records. It's undermined open justice, I would go far as saying.
Could anybody access it?
So you had to be somebody who had a right to access additional records about the courts, because it did include things such as victims' names and addresses. This is material you would be given if you were a journalist attending a court. So it was only a licence giving out to journalists or people with a very, very close, for example, academic need to research the system. But the problem is that now we can't access this. Now, to do the equivalent, I would have to set up an email account, get something like 150 different magistrates' courts email sort of round robins every day, have no problems with that, and then also have that running constantly to build up this archive, and then you've missed things, and it's just a complete logistical nightmare compared to what it was before.
Can you give us an example of an investigation you've done or a story that's been written that would have used the archive to get there?
Yeah, I mean, so last year we were looking at this crisis in the government's tagging system. So for listeners who don't recall, the contract for government tagging of people on things like suspended sentences was not going well. There were long delays between criminals having a sentence requiring a tag or a order requiring a tag, and that tag actually being fitted. Now, Court's Desk was great for this because what we could do is search across all these records and look for cases that really highlighted really stark examples of the harms that were coming from this failure to get people tagged. People, who had been stalkers, for example, who were supposed to be on a tag, weren't, and then had gone out and targeted their victims. But that kind of reporting that we used Court Desk for is now impossible. So it's utterly farcical for the minister to come out and say that journalist access to information has not been affected. It has. That is one example of where it's a report that I could not have done today that I could have done when Court Desk was running.
Is there any validity in the argument that this has made individuals vulnerable, though, that AI might have been involved that could have breached data protection? Because that should worry all of us, shouldn't it?
Of course, and if that was what had happened, I think it's something that the government would have been right to raise with the company. I don't necessarily agree that it was something they should shut off their access for. But my understanding of what the AI tool the company was using was actually to automate the removal of victim data from the records so that an inexperienced journalist didn't accidentally release the name or address of a victim. Actually, what they were doing was trying to make it safer for victims. And because the word AI was involved, it seems the government has freaked out, and that may explain why it's taken this decision. But, I think we need to be very careful with our data protection measures go forward, but I don't believe that's exactly what's happened in this case. And this overreaction means that journalists and the public at large are going to be made poorer for it.
If you wanted to go down what can sometimes be the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, would you arrive quite quickly at a position that was a government that simply didn't want to have such open justice?
I mean, I think it's more likely to be cock-up rather than conspiracy, but I think the problem the government has is if you search courts desks online now, you will find all these conspiracy theories about why they've shut it down. And those are spreading. That misinformation has come directly from their lack of transparency, because people, especially extremists, will jump into an issue where there's not enough transparency and create their own narratives. By not being transparent, they've actually created a problem of misinformation for everybody. I personally think it's more likely that there's been some decision that is a bit awkward, or there's something that's making life slightly difficult for someone in government, so they decided not to do it anymore, but did not appreciate that something like this is not just a nice to have. It's actually crucially important for a democratic society to have proper access to the courts. And, while in theory I could get the same information about one case from a court, and that's the basis of the government's declaration on this, in practice, I can't make access requests for information or use that information if I don't know where it is in the first place. And cutting out of the system makes it monumentally difficult to track those cases. It's ridiculous.
And have you had any kind of feedback from exactly those criticisms that you've made?
So in terms of
from the government,
they claim that they're trying to protect victims' data protection rights. But again, my concern is I don't think they quite understand what the problem was in this case. And I'm just concerned they've reacted without thinking about it and caused damage every day we don't have access to this archive to both open justice and also the ability of press to hold the government to account when we are in a courts crisis and things are going wrong in the courts. This will provide additional transparency of some of those issues as well. What's
going to be the worst case scenario because of this?
The worst case scenario is we miss trends in serious offences, miscarriages of justice. I mean, we've all talked about the post office scandal for many years as something where we had large numbers of wrongful prosecutions. What systems like Courts Desk allow is for you to look across cases, find patterns. If a certain kind of person is being prosecuted for a certain kind of offence, and you see that pattern repeated across the country, you can actually identify that early and prevent harm from happening. The risk of this is that journalists can't look at this information. They miss this because they can't track the awful system that exists at the moment. And really serious harm in the courts, miscarriages of justice, continue because no one can look at it across the piece and say that's something that's going wrong. It could really hurt people not having access to the system.
So we're talking about it now. You've written a fantastic column in the Times today, but George, the problem. This isn't the spiciest, sexiest area of injustice within the legal system, is it? So, I mean, it's hard. I'd never heard of Courts Desk before myself. People who are outside of journalism and the courts probably haven't heard of it either. Where do you get that kind of head of steam that might progress your call for something like this to be reinstated?
I think sometimes you just have to explain to people and trust your audience to understand that it might not be, a p in the pound on tax, for example, as a political issue, but actually this whole issue of transparency is crucially important to have the society we like to live in. As a journalist, I'm very lucky to work in the UK. Many of my international colleagues face threats every day, face physical threats to their existence. But actually in our country, unless we fight for our rights, unless we fight for access to this stuff, we're very much at risk of losing these rights. There's no right for us to have this kind of society. If we like having an open society, we have to fight for it every day. And I think explaining to people what the risks are of not fighting for issues like this, how it can affect their ability to live the lives they want, I think that's the way of getting people riled up, as you say, about such an issue. And I just think we need to, we say it's a boring issue, but I think let's just go out and explain it to people and actually try and explain to them why it's something they should care about, and hope that they understand from our point of view, those who are in this system, quite how frustrating it is where our rights of access are undermined.
Sure. I don't think it's boring at all. I wasn't meaning to imply that.
No, I know what you're saying. It's not necessarily
it's a process thing, which sometimes, does struggle to make headlines. But you're absolutely right to say if we hit worst case scenario, boy, we'd have headlines about it. George, thank you very much indeed. People can go on the Times app and take a read of the Thunderer column by George Greenwood.